My name is Antonia Bernard. I was born in Slovenia in 1942 and left in December 1961. My parents were farmers, peasants in the mountains on a small, isolated farm in the middle of a forest. The problem in Yugoslavia was that, especially at the beginning, well, we did not have collective farmers like in the Soviet Union, but they wanted farmers to disappear of their own accord because they were independent people. Consequently, some farmers exchanged their farms for Social Security, family benefits. But my family had nothing. For example, at school, there were some medical prevention programs. People would look at our teeth and say, "You need to go to that dentist." But we couldn't because it was too expensive. Things like that. I remember once when I was at high school, I had a whitlow and suffered with it for 2 nights. Then I went to the hospital to be treated and disinfected. It cost 4 months of savings that I had earned by giving private classes and through other work. I liked going to school, but we were taught, for example, that God didn't exist and that we had to tell our parents. So once I came back from school, I was very happy and said joyfully to my parents that God didn't exist, that they were old-fashioned. I got a smack for that. At school, what was disturbing, well, not for maths, there was no problem with that. But in the last year of high school, we had philosophy classes. Well, they were Marxism classes, of course. We had to learn everything by heart because our teacher thought we weren't able to understand. We wrote essays pretending we believed in what we wrote. It was the same for our high school leaving exam. We got used to these double standards. Real life on one hand and what we had to write in our essays on the other. We could all understand that there was a gap between official speeches and reality. You have to understand that tourism was a great source of income as well as money sent by the expatriate workers. Although I did not work when I was a student, a lot of my friends did. For example, boys were married in Slovenia and worked in Austria and sent the money back. So quite quickly, economic development became tangible. In the 70s and early 80s, things were very interesting and vibrant. You couldn't set up your own business, and Slovenians are real entrepreneurs. This comes from the time when Austria dominated the country, and it's still true throughout Central Europe. But you could start earning a little by yourself. For example, my brothers, when they worked at the factory or in the forests, one of them was a lumberjack. Well, they worked from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. in the factories, and then worked on something else to earn money or build a house. I experienced the housing boom. In today's Slovenia, 90% of people are homeowners. They own their house because they built them with their own hands. I felt like I lived in one of the most beautiful countries in the world, a kind of heaven, even though we had very, very little. I lived with 3 other pupils from high school and an old landlady. There was a kitchen and a large room. I slept in the same bed as another girl in the kitchen. The lady didn't give us much food, and when you're young, eating is the only thing you can do. Sometimes I would buy myself some bread, but that's all. I was happy. I felt I was totally free in a beautiful country. People's happiness was all that counted. I really thought this was the case. I think it also explains the state of well-being that people enjoyed. They lived in security. They could make something of their life, travel a little abroad. And that's when I saw the photograph of Tito in a white uniform on the kitchen wall at my parents', hanging near Christ. And it was the same in every home. Tito was the subject of many discussions because he was the non-aligned leader. So we thought everything was fine. And everybody believed so. When he died, people were sad, genuinely sad. And my personal opinion is that a dictator, because Tito was a dictator after all, for example, the husband of a doctor friend of mine was sent to jail in 1976 because he had dared to criticize Tito during a private party. Everything was underground. Yes, the main characteristic of any dictator is that they're loved. Stalin was loved. Tito was loved by the Yugoslavian people. People said that everything was fine, even though daily life was not always rosy. We were lacking things. But saying so helps you, you know. The gap between official speech, laws, and the reality was huge. The concept of self-management was great, but it never really worked in practice. So we could not build anything for real. Everything was fake, and everything collapsed. I was always surprised by the interest in self-management expressed by left-wingers in France. They asked questions and made comments like, voting for the university principal, that's great. But they were not told that there was only one candidate and that the latter was put forward by the party. So I was very surprised that nobody ever asked why a system, which was supposedly so perfect, disappeared from one day to the next, leaving no trace with the collapse of Yugoslavia. Well, it did so because it was just an idea laid out on paper. What hastened the end of the system was economic collapse with high inflation rising up to, in 1990, I don't remember, but around 200 or 300%. When you got your paycheck, you had to rush to the store. Otherwise, at the end of the month, it was 3 times the price.